October 24th, 1935, 8:37 p.m., Newark City Hospital, room 442. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the metallic scent of blood that clung to everything in the sterile white room. Arthur Dutch Schultz Flagenheimer lay dying on starched hospital sheets, his body riddled with bullets from the Palace Chop House shooting. The most feared man in New York, the rabid dog of the American mob, was reduced to fevered whispers and delusional ramblings. Police detectives huddled around his bedside with notebooks and tape recorders, hoping to catch a deathbed confession. His words came in broken fragments. "A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kim, French-Canadian bean soup." The ravings of a mind slipping away. At 8:43 p.m., a nurse entered carrying a yellow Western Union telegram. She handed it to Detective Luke Conlon, who tore open the envelope and read the message aloud. "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." The room fell silent. No signature was needed. Everyone knew who had sent it. While Dutch Schultz lay dying, surrounded by the wreckage of his violent empire, there was one person in New York who felt no pity, no fear, no remorse. A woman who had declared war on the most dangerous mobster in America, and won. He was the most feared man in New York, but in his final moments, the only person who dared to mock him was a woman from Harlem. A woman who had turned the underworld upside down, using nothing but intelligence, courage, and an unshakable belief that nobody, not the police, not the mob, not the system itself, could make her bow. This is the story of Stephanie St. Clair, the only woman who made the Mafia back down. To understand how a Caribbean immigrant became powerful enough to humiliate Dutch Schultz on his deathbed, you have to understand Harlem in 1922. This wasn't the sanitized version of the Harlem Renaissance that appears in history textbooks. This was a neighborhood where hope was currency and survival was strategy. The illegal lottery known as the numbers game or policy banking was more than gambling. It was the economic lifeline for a community that legitimate banks refused to serve. Every morning, thousands of Harlem residents would bet their nickels and dimes on 3-digit combinations, hoping that fortune would smile on them before rent day arrived. The odds were astronomical, but so was the desperation. And controlling those numbers meant controlling the financial heartbeat of the most vibrant black community in America. Stephanie St. Clair arrived from Martinique with $40 and a French-accented English that made her sound aristocratic even when discussing street business. She was 24 years old, educated, and possessed of an unshakable conviction that being a woman of color in 1920s America didn't mean accepting limitations imposed by others. Within 5 years, she had built an empire. Her headquarters at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, known as Sugar Hill, was a fortress of elegance and power. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors. Crystal chandeliers cast light on antique furniture imported from Europe. She conducted business wearing mink coats and silk gloves, speaking French to her Caribbean associates and perfect English to anyone else who mattered. By 1928, Madam Queen, as Harlem knew her, was reportedly keeping $500,000 in cash in her apartment, not in banks, where white institutions could freeze her assets, but in safety deposit boxes and hidden safes, where her wealth remained under her control. She employed hundreds of people, numbers runners who collected bets and distributed winnings, accountants who tracked the complex mathematics of probability, enforcers who ensured that debts were paid and territories respected. She paid them well, provided benefits that legitimate employers wouldn't offer black workers, and demanded loyalty in return. But Stephanie St. Clair's true innovation wasn't financial, It was psychological. She refused to operate from the shadows. While other numbers bankers conducted business in back rooms and basement clubs, she held court in her luxurious apartment, granting interviews to journalists and maintaining correspondence with politicians and lawyers. She understood something that every other criminal in New York had missed. Visibility was protection. The more public her profile, the harder it would be for authorities to eliminate her quietly. She made herself too famous to disappear. This strategy worked brilliantly until someone even more ruthless decided that Harlem's prosperity belonged to him.
Arthur Flegenheimer grew up poor and angry on the violent streets of the Bronx. By the time he adopted the alias Dutch Schultz, he had built a reputation for explosive violence and unpredictable brutality that made even seasoned mobsters nervous. Dutch wasn't strategic like Meyer Lansky or sophisticated like Lucky Luciano. He was a rabid dog in an expensive suit, effective in the short term, catastrophic in the long run. His solution to every problem was escalating violence. His approach to every negotiation was barely controlled rage. But he was also mathematically gifted when it came to identifying profitable opportunities. And by 1930, he had calculated that Harlem's numbers racket was generating more cash than most legitimate banks. Dutch dispatched his lieutenant, Bo Weinberg, to Harlem with a simple message for the neighborhood's numbers bankers. Submit to Dutch's authority and pay tribute, or be eliminated. One by one, Harlem's gambling kings capitulated. Some fled the city. Others accepted subordinate roles in Dutch's expanding empire. A few tried to resist and quickly learned that Dutch Schultz's reputation for violence wasn't exaggerated. But when Bo Weinberg arrived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue to deliver Dutch's ultimatum to Stephanie St. Clair, he encountered something unprecedented. A woman who laughed in his face. "Tell Mr. Flegenheimer," she said in her crisp, accented English, "that I will not pay a penny to a thug. Tell him that Harlem belongs to Harlem, and Harlem will never bow to the Bronx." Weinberg was momentarily speechless. In his experience, people threatened by Dutch Schultz responded with fear, negotiation, or desperate attempts at appeasement. Nobody had ever responded with contempt. "Lady, you don't understand what you're dealing with," he warned. "The Dutchmen don't take no for an answer." Stephanie adjusted her silk gloves and smiled. "Then Mr. Schultz is about to receive his first lesson in rejection. Please show yourself out." When Weinberg reported back to Dutch, the mobster's reaction was predictable. Explosive rage followed by detailed plans for violent retaliation. But Dutch Schultz had no idea what he was about to face. He thought he was intimidating another street-level criminal. Instead, he had just declared war on the smartest, most connected, and most fearless woman in New York. Dutch Schultz's first mistake was assuming that Stephanie St. Clair would fight like every other numbers banker he'd encountered, hiding in shadows, relying on negotiation, eventually surrendering when the pressure became unbearable. Instead, Madam Queen did something that shocked both the legitimate and criminal establishments. She went public with the conflict. In a series of interviews with the Amsterdam News and other black newspapers, she detailed Dutch's extortion attempts and framed the conflict in terms that resonated far beyond Harlem's gambling community. This wasn't just about illegal lottery operations. It was about economic self-determination, about a black community's right to control its own financial destiny, about resisting white supremacist attempts to extract wealth from black neighborhoods. The coverage transformed what Dutch intended as a private business dispute into a very public racial confrontation. Suddenly, Stephanie wasn't just defending her gambling empire, she was defending Harlem's independence.
But publicity alone couldn't stop Dutch Schultz's enforcers from smashing up her gambling parlors, intimidating her employees, and attempting to drive her out of business through systematic violence and sabotage. That's when Stephanie made the decision that would change both of their destinies forever. She hired Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was 23 years old in 1930, young, intelligent, and possessed of an unusual combination of strategic thinking and absolute fearlessness. He had grown up in Harlem, understood its rhythms and relations, and had earned respect through careful cultivation of both allies and enemies. The partnership between Stephanie and Bumpy was unlike anything in the history of organized crime. She provided the strategy, the connections, the political sophistication, and the financial resources. He provided the tactical expertise, the street credibility, and the willingness to engage Dutch's enforcers on their own violent terms. Together, they waged guerrilla warfare against Dutch Schultz's invasion. When Dutch's men smashed the windows of Stephanie's gambling parlors, Bumpy's crew retaliated by destroying Dutch's speakeasies in the Bronx. When Dutch attempted to intimidate Stephanie's numbers runners, Bumpy made Dutch's collectors afraid to venture south of 125th Street. When Dutch tried to buy protection from corrupt Harlem police officers, Stephanie's political connections ensured that those same officers faced federal scrutiny. For the first time in his criminal career, Dutch Schultz was fighting an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, bought, or eliminated through conventional methods. Every escalation of violence was met with equal retaliation. Every corrupt official he purchased was countered by a clean official Stephanie had cultivated. Every advantage he gained was neutralized by strategies he hadn't anticipated. By 1931, the war was costing Dutch more money than conquering Harlem could ever generate. His other operations were suffering because he was pouring resources into a conflict he couldn't win. His reputation for invincibility was being damaged by his inability to defeat a woman who had never fired a gun. That's when Dutch Schultz made his second major mistake. He decided to involve law enforcement in what should have remained a private criminal dispute. Dutch Schultz owned police officers the way other people owned furniture, as useful tools purchased for specific purposes and replaced when they broke or became obsolete. He had been buying police protection for years, treating badges as business licenses that could be rented by the month. In early 1932, Dutch instructed his corrupt contacts in the NYPD to intensify raids on Stephanie's operations while ignoring his own illegal businesses. The plan was to use the legal system as a weapon, bankrupting her through arrests, court costs, and confiscated equipment, while his own empire operated with police protection. For any other criminal, this strategy would have been devastating. Police raids, even when they don't result in convictions, can destroy cash flow, demoralize employees, and make normal business operations impossible. But Dutch Schultz had forgotten that Stephanie St. Clair wasn't any other criminal. Instead of accepting the increased police harassment as an inevitable cost of doing business, Stephanie did something that shocked both the criminal underworld and the legitimate establishment. She decided to destroy the entire system of police corruption that Dutch depended on. On March 15, 1932, Stephanie St. Clair walked into the offices of the Seabury Commission, a state investigation into corruption in New York City government, and volunteered to testify under oath about police corruption in Harlem. This was beyond unprecedented. This was criminal suicide. The unwritten rule of organized crime was that you never, ever, under any circumstances, testified against police officers. Even criminals who hated corrupt cops understood that the alternative, honest law enforcement, was worse for everyone in illegal businesses. But Stephanie St. Clair understood something that Dutch Schultz couldn't comprehend. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a businesswoman operating in an illegal industry because legitimate opportunities were denied to people who looked like her. She had no fundamental loyalty to the criminal ecosystem that excluded her from its inner circles while exploiting her community. If the system of corruption that Dutch Schultz depended on had to be burned down to protect her independence, she was prepared to light the match. Her testimony was devastating. Speaking in her calm, accented English, she provided detailed accounts of specific police officers accepting specific bribes from specific criminals. She named names, cited dates, produced records. She described the systematic nature of the corruption, the chain of command that enabled it, and the way it protected white criminals while prosecuting black ones. Most damaging of all, she revealed the exact amounts that Dutch Schultz was paying to specific police officials, the services he was receiving in return, and the methods he used to coordinate raids on his competitors while protecting his own operations. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. 13 police officers were fired within a month. 2 police captains were criminally prosecuted. The entire network of corrupt relationships that Dutch had spent years building was exposed and dismantled. Dutch Schultz had lost his most powerful weapon, police protection, because he had underestimated the woman he was fighting. But Stephanie St. Clair wasn't finished. The kamikaze attack on police corruption was only the beginning of Dutch Schultz's destruction. By 1935, Dutch Schultz was a man trapped by his own violence and paranoia. The war with Stephanie St. Clair had cost him his police protection, damaged his reputation for invincibility, and drained resources from his other criminal enterprises. But worse than the financial losses was the psychological impact. Dutch's entire identity was built on being feared. He was the man other criminals crossed the street to avoid. He was the boogeyman that parents in the Bronx used to frighten disobedient children. And a woman from Harlem had made him look weak. In his desperation to restore his reputation, Dutch Schultz made the decision that sealed his fate. He announced his intention to assassinate Thomas E. Dewey, the special prosecutor who had been targeting organized crime figures across New York City. To the other leaders of American organized crime, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, this was the final proof that Dutch Schultz had become too unstable to remain in business. Killing prosecutors brought federal heat that endangered everyone's operations. Dutch's obsession with revenge was threatening the entire criminal ecosystem. On October 23, 1935, the National Crime Commission issued Dutch Schultz's death warrant. The hit took place at the Palace Chop House in Newark, a restaurant Dutch frequented because he assumed it was outside his enemy's territory. He was sitting at a corner table with 3 associates when 2 gunmen walked in and opened fire. Dutch took multiple bullets to the abdomen. His 3 companions were killed instantly. The gunmen walked out as calmly as they had entered, leaving Dutch to die slowly on the black and white checkered floor.
But Dutch Schultz was too stubborn to die quietly. He was rushed to Newark City Hospital, where he lingered for nearly 22 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling incoherent statements to the police detectives who hoped he might name his killers. That's when the telegram arrived. The nurse who delivered it later told reporters that she had never seen police officers look so shocked. The message was brief, biblical, and brutal in its simplicity. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. No signature was needed. Everyone in that hospital room knew exactly who had sent it. While Dutch Schultz lay dying, Stephanie St. Clair was sitting in her elegant apartment on Sugar Hill, sipping French champagne and reading the evening newspapers. She had outlasted the most violent mobster in New York without firing a shot, without hiding in shadows, without compromising her principles. She had proven that intelligence, properly applied, was more powerful than violence, that strategy could defeat brute force, that a woman of color in 1930s America could beat the system by refusing to accept the limitations it tried to impose. The telegram wasn't just revenge, it was a declaration of victory from someone who had never doubted the outcome of their war. Section 7. Legacy. Dutch Schultz died at 8:35 p.m. on October 24, 1935, taking his secrets and his paranoia to the grave. His criminal empire collapsed within weeks. His associates were absorbed into other organizations or eliminated as potential witnesses. His reign of terror ended with a whimper of delirious final words that made no sense to anyone. Stephanie St. Clair retired from the numbers business, a wealthy woman. She had proven her point, established her independence, and outlasted her enemies. There was no need to continue fighting battles she had already won. She married Sufi Abdul Hamid, a black nationalist and labor organizer who shared her passion for economic justice and community empowerment. She used her fortune to support civil rights causes, fund education programs, and promote black-owned businesses throughout Harlem. She lived comfortably until 1969, 34 years longer than the man who had tried to destroy her. While Dutch Schultz became a footnote in criminal history, remembered primarily for his violent instability and dramatic death, Stephanie St. Clair became a legend. Her victory over Dutch Schultz established a template that influenced organized crime for decades. Public exposure was more powerful than private violence. Media attention could destroy criminal enterprises faster than machine guns. Legal warfare could accomplish what illegal warfare couldn't. Most importantly, she proved that the American underworld's assumption about power, that it belonged exclusively to white men willing to use violence, was fundamentally wrong. The Queen of Numbers had rewritten the rules of the game. And when those new rules were applied to Dutch Schultz, they destroyed him completely. In a world where most gangsters died young or died in prison, Stephanie St. Clair died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by luxury and respect, having outlasted every enemy who had underestimated her. She had beaten the system by refusing to accept that the system was unbeatable. And 34 years after Dutch Schultz's death, as she drew her last breath in the same Harlem apartment where she had built her empire, one fact remained unchanged. She had never, not once, paid a penny to a thug. The Queen had kept her word, and the Queen had won.